Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Please settle into your chairs, dim the lights, and allow the world to slow just a little. Tonight's mystery comes to us from a house where time does not merely pass, it speaks. At precisely 12 o'clock each night, a clock whispers. Not chimes, not ticks, but words, soft, deliberate, and dangerous. Some say the clock remembers a crime, others say it predicts one. And when death finally arrives at midnight, the truth will be revealed not by footprints or fingerprints, but by time itself. This is The Whispering Clock at Midnight, a classic radio mystery from Hercule Mysteries. Stay with us and listen closely. Chapter 1. When time learned to whisper, the house had learned the sound of midnight long before anyone thought to fear it. Every night, without exception, the grandfather clock in the east hallway announced the hour with a deep, patient chime, 12 measured strokes that echoed through Blackthorn House like a ritual older than memory. The sound traveled along polished corridors, slipped beneath closed doors, and settled gently into sleep. But lately, something had changed. The clock had begun to whisper, not loudly, not clearly, but distinctly enough to be heard. Blackthorn House stood alone at the edge of the village, its tall windows staring outward with the unblinking patience of something that had witnessed generations rise and fall. Built in the late 19th century, it was a place of habits. Habits that did not like to be disturbed. At precisely 11:50 each night, Mrs. Eleanor Price made her final round. She was the housekeeper, though the word hardly captured her authority. Eleanor had served the Blackthorn family for over 30 years. She knew every creak of the stairs, every draught that slipped through the west wing, every tick of every clock, especially that one. She paused now, candle held steady, listening. Tick, tick, tick. The grandfather clock loomed before her, tall and dark, its glass face reflecting her lined expression. Its brass pendulum swung with hypnotic certainty. "Behave yourself," she murmured as she always did. The clock did not answer, at least not yet. The household had grown smaller in recent years. Once Blackthorn House had echoed with dinners, guests, and laughter carried on polished silver trays. Now only a handful remained. At the head of it all was Reginald Blackthorn, widower, patriarch, and keeper of the family fortune. A man whose voice had once commanded boardrooms now rarely rose above irritation. He spent his evenings in the study, surrounded by ledgers, letters, and the quiet certainty that everything still belonged to him. That night he sat beneath a green-shaded lamp, eyes scanning a document with the intensity of a man reading betrayal. "Time," he muttered, "always tells." Across the house, others listened for midnight with different feelings. Margaret Blackthorn, his niece, lay awake in her room, staring at the ceiling. The clock's chimes had always unsettled her, but lately she dreaded what came after. Arthur Bell, the secretary, pretended to sleep in the guest wing, his mind replaying conversations he wished he had never overheard, and Mrs. Eleanor Price waited in the hallway. The first whisper had been dismissed, a trick of acoustics, Eleanor told herself. Old houses made sounds, pipes shifted, wood spoke. But when it happened again the following night, and again the night after, doubt took root. At midnight exactly, after the 12th chime faded, the whisper came, low, measured, almost intentional. A breath shaped like words. Eleanor could never quite make out what it said, only that it was saying something. She crossed herself the third night and did not linger. The incident that changed everything occurred on a Thursday, a night when the air felt heavy, when clouds pressed low against the windows, when even the pendulum seemed reluctant to swing. At 11:59, the household was silent. Tick, tick, tick. Margaret sat upright in bed. Arthur held his breath in the dark. Eleanor stood at the end of the hall, candle trembling slightly in her hand. The clock struck 1, 2, 3, 12. The final chime faded, and the whisper followed immediately. This time it was louder, clearer. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. The sound did not drift randomly. It emerged from inside the clock itself, from behind the glass, from within the mechanism. A voice, old, tired, accusatory. Eleanor stepped back. And from the study, a chair scraped violently against the floor. They found Reginald Blackthorn moments later, slumped forward at his desk, one hand clutching a sheet of paper, the other hanging limply at his side. His eyes were open. The clock was still whispering. When dawn arrived, it brought no comfort, only questions. The local doctor pronounced death quickly. Heart failure, perhaps. Shock, certainly. But Eleanor knew better. She'd seen fear before, and Reginald Blackthorne had died afraid. By mid-morning, the house was full of murmurs. The doctor spoke of stress, Margaret spoke of coincidence, Arthur spoke very little at all, and Eleanor spoke of the clock. "They say it whispers," she told the constable, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "At midnight, every night," the constable frowned. "Clocks don't whisper." "This one does," Eleanor replied. News traveled faster than reason ever did. By afternoon, the village had a story. By evening, it had a legend. And by nightfall, a telegram had been sent. Not to the police, not to the coroner, but to a man who understood that mysteries often announce themselves quietly. When Hercule Poirot received the message, he read it twice. A death at midnight, a whispering clock, a house full of secrets. Poirot allowed himself a thin smile. "Ah," he murmured, "time has spoken." He reached for his coat. Back at Blackthorne House, the clock was silent again, too silent. Eleanor passed it once more before retiring, candle held close. For the first time in years, the pendulum had stopped. She stared at it, heart pounding. "Please," she whispered, "no more." The clock did not answer, but somewhere deep within its silent frame, something waited, patient as time itself. Chapter 2. The House That Held Its Breath. If Blackthorne House had possessed lungs, it would have exhaled when the telegram was sent. Instead, it held its breath. The day after Reginald Blackthorne's death moved with the careful slowness of a house trying not to disturb its own grief. The corridors were quieter than usual, yet full of presence, the kind that comes when people stop speaking aloud and begin speaking only in their minds. Mrs. Eleanor Price kept the household running out of habit more than will. Breakfast was served, curtains were drawn, fires were tended, but nothing warmed. Everything felt damp, as though the night's whisper had soaked into the wallpaper. The grandfather clock in the East Hall stood still. Its pendulum did not swing, its hands remained fixed at 12, and the silence it wore was more unsettling than its whisper had ever been. Constable Everett Lane arrived shortly after 10. He was a capable man of the village, stout, practical, and uncomfortable in large houses. He removed his hat at the doorway, hesitated, then stepped inside with the stiffness of someone entering a church. "Mrs. Price," he said gently, "I'm sorry for your loss." Eleanor inclined her head. "Thank you, Constable. The house will manage." Lane glanced down the corridor toward the study where the door remained shut. "The doctor says it was the heart." "The doctor says many things," Eleanor replied, her tone neutral. Lane frowned. "Do you disagree?" Eleanor's eyes flicked to the silent clock. "I disagree with how afraid he was," she said. Lane exhaled. "The village is talking." "The village always talks," Eleanor replied. "But now it's talking about the clock." Lane's mouth tightened. "Yes, that's why I'm here." The study door opened with a reluctant creak. Inside, Reginald Blackthorne's final night still clung to the room. The green-shaded lamp had been extinguished, but its faint heat remained in the air like a ghost of responsibility. Papers lay scattered across the desk, not wildly, and Reginald had never been wild, but in a way that suggested interruption. A conversation halted mid-sentence. Constable Lane approached the desk and examined the chair, the carpet, the window latch. "No sign of struggle," he murmured. "There was no struggle," Eleanor said quietly. "Whatever happened, happened inside him." Lane pointed at the paper in Reginald's hand. "What is this?" Eleanor stepped forward, careful. "A letter." Lane read the top line and frowned. "It's unsigned." Eleanor nodded. "He was reading it when the clock struck." Lane looked up sharply. "How do you know that?" "I heard the chair scrape," Eleanor replied. "And then I ran." Lane set the paper down. "What did the letter say?" Eleanor hesitated. "I only saw part. It mentioned the family name and something about—" The study window rattled softly as a draft slipped through. Lane turned toward it, uneasy. "Something about time," Eleanor finished, voice barely above a whisper. Margaret Blackthorne appeared in the doorway like a shadow made of silk and exhaustion. She was in her late 20s, elegant in a fragile way, with eyes too wide for a house that offered too little comfort. She held herself with practiced composure, but her hands betrayed her, fingers intertwined too tightly, knuckles pale. "Constable," she said politely, "have you concluded it was natural?" Lane cleared his throat. "The doctor believes so, Miss Blackthorne, but with the talk, I'm obligated to satisfy superstition." Margaret's smile was thin. "Of course." Eleanor's eyes narrowed slightly. Margaret's tone held irritation, but also something else. Fear, not of ghosts, of consequences. Arthur Bell arrived minutes later, summoned by Eleanor. He was Reginald's secretary, a man of 35 with neat hair and a nervous habit of adjusting his cuffs. He looked as though he had slept in his clothes. "I came as soon as Mrs. Price sent word," he said quickly. Lane observed him. "You were here last night." Arthur nodded. "Yes, Reginald requested I stay. He had correspondence." "Did you see him after midnight?" Arthur hesitated. "No, I retired to the guest wing before then." Eleanor's gaze sharpened. "Before midnight?" Arthur swallowed. "Yes." Lane scribbled notes. "Did you hear anything? The clock, perhaps?" Arthur's eyes flicked involuntarily toward the hall. "I heard the chimes," he admitted, "but not whispers." Eleanor studied him carefully. Arthur was lying, not about what he heard, perhaps, but about what he wanted them to believe. By noon, the household had assembled in the drawing-room. Eleanor, stiff and controlled. Margaret, pale and poised. Arthur, tense as a coiled spring. Lane stood near the fireplace, hat in his hands, uncomfortable. "I'll be frank," Lane began. "The village thinks something unnatural occurred." Margaret sighed. "Of course it does," Lane continued. "There's talk that Mr. Blackthorne was threatened, that the clock—" Eleanor interrupted, voice firm. "The clock has been whispering for days." Lane looked at her sharply. "How many days?" "4," Eleanor replied. "Perhaps 5." Arthur's head snapped up. "5?" Eleanor turned to him. "Yes." Arthur's throat bobbed. "I didn't know." Margaret's gaze sharpened. "You didn't know because you never walk that hall at night." Eleanor's lips tightened. There was history in that remark. Lane cleared his throat. "Has anyone tried to open the clock?" Eleanor's expression hardened. "No one touches that clock." Margaret scoffed softly. "It's just wood and brass." Eleanor looked at her. "It is an heirloom, and it keeps better secrets than some living people." The room fell silent. Lane rubbed his forehead. "All right, I'll examine the clock myself." Eleanor stiffened. "No," Lane blinked. "Mrs. Price, I must—" Eleanor stepped forward, voice low. "Constable, that clock belonged to Reginald's father, and his father before him. People have stared into it for generations, and whenever someone tried to tamper with it, something in this house changed." Margaret's composure cracked for a moment. "That's nonsense," but her voice trembled. Lane swallowed. "Even so, I need to ensure there's no trick," Arthur whispered. "Maybe it is a trick." Everyone turned to him. Arthur flushed. "I mean, it could be a mechanism, a hidden device, someone playing games." Margaret's eyes narrowed. "Who would do that?" Arthur did not answer. At precisely 3 o'clock, the sound of a car outside drew their attention. Eleanor moved to the window. A dark vehicle had stopped at the gate. A man stepped out, small but impeccably dressed, moving with the deliberate confidence of someone who never rushed yet never wasted time. He carried a suitcase. He wore gloves. His moustache was trimmed with geometric pride. Eleanor's breath escaped her. "Who is that?" Lane asked. Eleanor turned, voice suddenly steadier. "That, Constable Dior, is Monsieur Poirot." In the entrance hall, Poirot was greeted by Eleanor's restrained relief. "Mrs. Price," he said kindly, pronouncing her name with careful respect, "you sent for me. I am honored." Lane stepped forward. "I am Constable Everett Lane. I must say, monsieur, we have no formal case. The doctor—" Poirot raised a hand gently. "Ah, yes, the doctor says it was the heart, and perhaps it was. But tell me, Constable, does a heart stop so neatly when the house is full of whispers?" Lane flushed. People exaggerate, Poirot smiled. People always do, but exaggeration has a mother, and her name is Truth. He turned toward the corridor. The clock, Poirot said quietly. Eleanor nodded. Poirot walked toward it as though approaching a witness rather than an object. The grandfather clock stood motionless, hands fixed at midnight. Dust gleamed faintly on its face where the light struck it. Poirot leaned closer. He did not touch it. Not yet. He simply listened. Interesting, he murmured. Lane frowned. It's silent, Poirot nodded. Yes, he straightened slowly, but silence, my friend, is sometimes a deliberate choice. Poirot requested to see the study. Inside, he examined the desk, the scattered papers, the letter in Reginald's hand. He read it carefully, his expression tightening at certain lines. He murmured. What is it? Lane asked. Poirot folded the letter. A threat, Margaret stiffened. A threat to my uncle? Poirot's eyes flicked to her. Not only to your uncle, mademoiselle, to the name, to the house, to the secrets. Arthur's face went paler. Eleanor whispered, I knew it. Poirot placed the letter down gently. Tell me, who else knew this letter existed? No one answered. Poirot smiled faintly. Then we have our first useful silence. As evening approached, Poirot requested one unusual thing. That tonight, he said calmly, no one sleeps. Margaret's eyes widened. That's absurd. Poirot's voice was soft but firm. At midnight, the clock whispered, and a man died. Either the whisper is a coincidence, or it is a message. Arthur swallowed. And if it whispers again? Poirot's eyes gleamed. Then we will listen properly. Lane shifted uncomfortably. Monsieur Poirot, I must insist. Poirot cut him off gently. Constable, you may insist on procedure. I insist on truth. He turned to Eleanor. Mrs. Price, he said, tell me where you stood when you heard it. Eleanor pointed down the hallway. There, near the runner. Poirot nodded, storing the detail. And you, Monsieur Bell, where were you? Arthur hesitated. In my room. Poirot smiled. We shall see. Margaret's voice was sharp. And what about me? Poirot looked at her with sudden gentleness. You were awake, mademoiselle. You expected something. Margaret stiffened. I did not. Poirot's tone remained polite. Time will tell. That night, Blackthorn House prepared for midnight like a stage preparing for its second act. Lights were left burning, doors remained ajar, breathing became audible. The grandfather clock stood silently in the east hall, hands still fixed at 12, as if time itself had been pinned. Poirot sat in the drawing room, calm and unmoving, as though he could command the air by simply occupying it. At 11:58, Eleanor took her position, near the corridor. At 11:59, Lane stood beside the clock, tense, and at midnight, Poirot rose. He walked toward the hall. Tick, tick, a faint movement within the clock, a whisper waiting behind glass. Poirot lifted one finger to his lips. Shh, he breathed. Now we listen. Chapter 3. When midnight spoke clearly, Blackthorn House did not announce midnight. It awaited it. The air in the east hallway felt heavier as the minute hand crept closer to 12. Lamps burned steadily, yet their light seemed reluctant, as though it feared what it might reveal. No one spoke now. Even breathing felt intrusive. Hercule Poirot stood slightly apart from the others, hands folded behind his back, eyes fixed not on the clock face, but on its case. The grandfather clock loomed tall and dignified, its polished wood absorbing the glow of the lamps. Its hands were still frozen at 12, unmoving since Reginald Blackthorn's death. The pendulum, which should have been swinging, rested motionless like a held breath. Poirot had noticed this immediately. A clock, he believed, was never simply wrong by accident. At 11:59, Constable Lane shifted his weight. This is madness, he whispered. We're standing around a piece of furniture. Poirot did not look at him. No, my friend, we are standing around memory. Margaret Blackthorn sat rigidly on the edge of a chair, her hands clasped in her lap. Her eyes never left the clock. She told herself it was superstition that made her heart pound. Nothing more. Arthur Bell stood near the doorway, pale, his posture tense. Every few seconds his gaze flicked toward the study, the place where Reginald Blackthorne had died. Mrs. Eleanor Price stood closest to the hall runner, candle held firmly despite the slight tremor in her wrist. Of them all, she looked the least surprised, as though part of her had been expecting this moment for years. The second hand, which should not have been moving at all, twitched. Lane inhaled sharply. "Did you see that?" Poirot raised one finger, silencing him. Tick. The sound was faint, almost imagined. Tick. Margaret's breath caught. Tick. The clock's hands began to move, slowly, reluctantly, as if dragged forward by an unseen force. Arthur whispered, "That's impossible." Poirot murmured, "Impossible things merely require patience." The first chime struck. 1. The sound was deeper than expected, vibrating through the floorboards. 2. Margaret flinched. 3. Arthur wiped sweat from his brow. 4. 5. 6. With each chime, the air thickened, as though the house itself were counting along. 7, 8, 9. Mrs. Price closed her eyes. 10, 11, and then 12. The final chime lingered longer than the rest, echoing down the corridors, seeping into corners where secrets preferred to live. Silence followed, not immediately. A pause. Poirot leaned forward slightly. "Now," he whispered. The whisper came, clearer than before. It did not drift. It did not echo. It emerged, directly from within the clock, a low, deliberate voice shaped by wood and metal, softened by distance, but unmistakably human. "You cannot outrun time," Margaret gasped. Arthur stumbled backward, knocking into the wall. Mrs. Price whispered a prayer. Constable Lane froze, eyes wide. Poirot closed his eyes, listening, not with fear, but with focus. The whisper continued, halting and uneven, as though struggling through resistance. "What was taken must be returned." The sound faded. The pendulum twitched once, then stopped. For several seconds, no one moved. Then Arthur shouted, "That's a trick! It has to be!" Lane found his voice. "Monsieur Poirot, I heard it. I heard it." Poirot opened his eyes calmly. "Yes, Constable, so did we all." Margaret's composure cracked. "What does it mean?" Poirot turned to her gently. "That depends, mademoiselle, on what was taken." Lane moved toward the clock. "I'm opening it." "No," Poirot said sharply. Lane hesitated. "You heard it. This isn't—" Poirot placed himself between Lane and the clock. "You will open it," Poirot said calmly. "After you understand why it spoke." Arthur laughed nervously. "It's some sort of mechanism. A recording. Someone planted it." Poirot turned toward him. "Ah, someone." Arthur stiffened. Poirot continued softly. "A recording requires 3 things, Monsieur Bell. A device, access, and time." He gestured toward the clock. "This clock has stood here for over 60 years. Its case is sealed. Its interior is traditional." Margaret frowned. "Traditional?" Poirot nodded. "No wires, no batteries, no modern conveniences." Lane stared at the clock with renewed unease. "Then how—" Poirot smiled faintly. "By being understood, not violated." Poirot asked them all to sit. Reluctantly, they obeyed. "Let us begin," Poirot said, "with what the clock said." He repeated the words precisely. "You cannot outrun time. What was taken must be returned." Arthur shook his head. "It's nonsense." Poirot looked at him sharply. "Is it?" Arthur fell silent. Poirot turned to Mrs. Price. "Madame, how long have you worked here?" 32 years, Eleanor replied. "And in that time," Poirot asked, "has anything ever been removed from this house quietly?" Eleanor's eyes flickered. Margaret spoke quickly. "This is absurd. My uncle was meticulous." Poirot nodded. "Yes, about money." Arthur swallowed hard. Poirot noticed. "Constable," Poirot said, "please fetch the letter found in the study." Lane returned moments later. Poirot read aloud one line, not the entire letter, just enough. "You have lived comfortably on what was never yours." Margaret's breath hitched. "That's—" Poirot raised a hand. "That line," he continued, "was written recently, but the accusation is old." He turned to Eleanor. "Madame Price, whose handwriting resembles this?" Eleanor's face paled. "It is similar to Mr. Blackthorn's," Poirot nodded. "But not exact." Arthur stood abruptly. "You can't be suggesting—" Poirot's gaze was steady. "Sit down, Monsieur Bell." Arthur sat. Poirot approached the clock at last. He knelt, examining the base. "A grandfather clock," he explained quietly, "is not merely a timekeeper, it is a container. Sound travels inside it in very particular ways." He tapped gently near the lower panel. "Hollow," he murmured. Lane leaned closer. "Are you saying that the whisper was not a voice?" Poirot said. "But an echo." Margaret frowned. "An echo of what?" Poirot looked at Arthur. Arthur's face drained of color. "An echo of a confession," Poirot said softly. "Spoken once, preserved, and returned." Arthur stammered. "That's impossible." Poirot shook his head. "It is difficult, not impossible." He turned to Eleanor. "Madame, did Reginald Blackthorne ever argue here, near the clock?" Eleanor nodded slowly. "Many times." "And did he ever raise his voice?" Poirot asked. "Yes." "And did someone else ever respond?" Poirot pressed. Eleanor hesitated and then nodded again. Arthur's hands shook. Poirot stood. "Sound," he said, "can be trapped. Not magically, but mechanically. Certain chambers, certain materials, certain structures can hold vibration longer than we expect." He looked at Arthur. "You recorded a conversation, Monsieur Bell. Perhaps unintentionally at first, perhaps later, intentionally?" Arthur shook his head wildly. No, that's—" Poirot continued calmly. "You hid the recording within the clock's resonance chamber. Not a modern recording, no tape, no wire." Lane blinked. "Then how?" Poirot smiled. "By timing." He turned the clock's winding key slightly. A faint click sounded. The pendulum moved. The whisper did not return. Poirot straightened. "You set it to release fragments of sound at midnight," Poirot said. "Triggered by vibration. The house itself did the work." Arthur collapsed into the chair. "I didn't mean for him to die," Arthur whispered. "I wanted to scare him." Margaret stared. "Arthur, what did you do?" Arthur covered his face. "He knew. He knew I had taken money years ago. I paid it back, quietly. But he wanted control. He wanted silence." Poirot nodded. "So you returned time to him, in pieces?" Arthur sobbed. "I never thought—" Poirot interrupted gently. "That fear can kill." Constable Lane stepped forward. "Monsieur Bell, I'm placing you under arrest." Arthur did not resist. As Lane led him away, the house seemed to relax, as though something lodged deep within it had finally been dislodged. Margaret sank into her chair, shaking. Poirot turned to Eleanor. "You heard whispers," he said, "but you also heard truth." Eleanor nodded slowly. "I knew time would speak." Poirot allowed himself a small smile. "Yes," he said, "it always does." Later that night, as the house settled once more, Poirot stood alone before the grandfather clock. It ticked normally now. Tick, tick, tick. No whisper. Poirot adjusted his mustache. "A clever clock," he murmured, "but no match for patience." He turned away, and Blackthorne House finally exhaled. Chapter 4. The second crime was quieter, if the house had been a stage, and Poirot believed it was. Then the whisper at midnight had been the dramatic cue. The lights had risen, the audience had gasped, and one guilty man had broken beneath the weight of fear. But Poirot had learned something important long ago. When a mystery appears to solve itself too quickly, it is rarely solved at all. Blackthorne House looked calmer after Arthur Bell was taken away, yet it felt wrong in a way that was hard to name. The air had lost its tight panic, yes, but it had gained something colder, a thin, careful quiet, like a room that has just swallowed a lie. Mrs. Eleanor Price walked the corridor with a rigid posture, as if the floorboards might remember every footstep. Margaret Blackthorne sat in the drawing room with her hands clasped, not crying, not speaking, simply staring at the fire with eyes that seemed to be waiting for permission to blink. Constable Lane lingered by the door, hat in hand, as though uncertain whether he was allowed to leave a house that had learned to whisper, and Poirot, standing by the grandfather clock, listened to the normal tick, 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 tick. "No whisper," Lane said, almost relieved. "So it was Bell, a trick." A confession device. He admits it. He's under arrest. Poirot did not turn. He admits one thing, my friend. Lane frowned. He admitted to stealing money and setting up the… Poirot raised a hand. Yes, he admitted to theft and to intimidation. Poirot's eyes remained on the clock face. But tell me, Constable, he said softly, did he admit to murder? Lane hesitated. He said he didn't mean to kill him. Poirot nodded. Exactly. He turned now, moustache immaculate, expression mild. Many people do not mean to kill, Poirot said. And yet, death arrives. Lane's jaw tightened. You think Bell is lying? Poirot's voice was gentle. I think Bell is guilty of something that resembles murder from a distance and very different from close. May he walk toward the study? I would like to examine the first crime, Poirot said, before we declare it the only one. But the study was still a wound. The desk remained where Reginald Blackthorne had died. Though the chair had been pushed back and the papers gathered into neat piles, Eleanor's idea of restoring dignity. But death did not accept tidiness. Poirot approached the desk and leaned down, sniffing lightly near the edge where Reginald's hand had been found. Constable Lane watched, uneasy. Monsieur Poirot, the doctor said… Poirot held up a finger. Ah, yes, the doctor. A good man, perhaps. But doctors sometimes see the body as a machine, and machines, as you know, do not always explain the timing. Poirot lifted the paper Reginald had clutched, the unsigned letter with its sharp accusation, and studied the ink, the pressure of the handwriting, the faint tremor in certain strokes. A letter meant to frighten, Poirot murmured. He turned it over. On the back, barely visible, was a partial smear, not ink, not dirt. Poirot touched it with the edge of a handkerchief. His eyes narrowed. Lane leaned in. What is it? Poirot's voice lowered. Wax. Lane blinked. Candle wax? Poirot nodded slowly. Yes, fresh, soft, not from a long time ago. He looked toward the doorway, then toward the hall. The letter was handled near a candle, Poirot said, very close to the time of death. Lane frowned. But Bell could have… Poirot cut him off gently. Bell claims he was in his room. Lane hesitated. He could be lying. Poirot smiled faintly. He could, but there is a problem. What problem? Poirot held up the paper. This wax is a specific shade, not the cheap white candle the house uses in corridors. He turned toward Eleanor's candle in her hand. That one, Poirot said softly, is different. Eleanor stiffened at once. It's beeswax, she said quickly. I use it. It burns cleaner. Poirot nodded. Indeed. His tone remained polite, but his eyes sharpened. And who had that candle on the night of death? Eleanor's lips parted, then closed. I did, she said finally. Margaret's gaze flicked to Eleanor, quick and bright, and like a spark of alarm, Poirot noticed. Poirot requested Dr. Holden Fenn, the physician who had pronounced Reginald dead, to return. Dr. Fenn arrived just before noon, weary and defensive, as doctors often are when asked to reconsider their certainty. Monsieur Poirot, he said stiffly, I understand you are thorough, but Mr. Blackthorne was an older gentleman. Under stress, heart failure is not uncommon. Poirot nodded. Yes, but is it complete? Dr. Fenn tightened. What do you mean? Poirot gestured toward Reginald's desk. Did you examine the mouth, the tongue, the hands, the pupils, any unusual odor? Any residue in the teacup? Dr. Fenn hesitated. There was no teacup. Poirot's eyebrows lifted. No tea? In a house of routine? In a man of habits? Margaret spoke sharply from the doorway. My uncle disliked tea at night. Poirot turned his head slightly. He disliked tea, mademoiselle. But did he dislike brandy? Margaret froze. Eleanor's candle trembled, just slightly. Poirot smiled gently, as if it were a harmless question. Dr. Fenn cleared his throat. There may have been a small glass. I assumed it was earlier. Poirot's voice remained calm. Where is it? Lane looked at Eleanor. Mrs. Price. Eleanor swallowed. I cleared the study after the doctor left. Poirot's eyes narrowed. You cleared it, he repeated. Why? Eleanor's voice sharpened. Because it was undignified. He deserved. Poirot raised a hand. He deserved truth. The room went very quiet. Poirot turned back to Dr. Fenn. If the glass were present, would you examine it? Dr. Fenn hesitated, then nodded slowly. Yes. Poirot looked to Eleanor. Then we will find it. They searched, not wildly, not dramatically. Poirot did everything as though he were tidying a thought rather than hunting evidence. He walked with precision, opening drawers with respect, lifting paperweights, tracing the edges of shelves. At last, in a cabinet beneath a stack of ledgers, he found it, a small brandy glass, washed too clean, left upside down on a saucer. Poirot lifted it and held it to the light. Lane frowned. It's clean. Poirot smiled faintly. Too clean. He inhaled near its rim. A faint bitterness, Poirot murmured. Dr. Fenn took the glass carefully, sniffed, then looked up with a discomfort that was immediate. This, Dr. Fenn said slowly, has been washed, but there may be residue. What sort? Lane asked. Dr. Fenn's voice dropped. Something like laudanum or a bitter tincture. It's impossible to say without proper testing. Margaret's hand flew to her throat. Eleanor's eyes darted toward the door. Poirot watched both reactions as one might watch two clocks striking different hours. Constable Lane exhaled sharply. Are you saying Mr. Blackthorne was poisoned? Poirot did not answer directly. He walked to the window, stared out at the grey daylight, and spoke as though narrating to an unseen audience. When a man dies at midnight, Poirot said softly, it is tempting to blame the hour, the whisper, the shock. He turned. But shock is not the same as certainty. Lane's voice was tight. Bell set up the whisper. The whisper frightened him. That could be enough. Poirot nodded. Yes, it could. He held up a finger. But then why hide the glass? Why wash it? Why clear the evidence? Before the constable could see it. Lane looked at Eleanor. Eleanor's voice rose. I didn't hide anything. I cleaned. Poirot's tone was mild. Cleaning is sometimes the most innocent form of concealment. Margaret stood abruptly. This is ridiculous. You're accusing her because she keeps house. Poirot's gaze shifted to Margaret. I am accusing no one, Poirot said gently. I am observing something. Margaret's eyes flashed. And what is that? Poirot walked toward her, calm as a man approaching a clock that cannot lie. That you are protecting someone, Poirot said softly. And I do not yet know if it is Eleanor or yourself. Margaret's face went white. Lane stiffened. Monsieur Poirot. Poirot raised a hand, silencing him. Let us speak plainly, Poirot said. Arthur Bell created the whisper to frighten Reginald Blackthorne. Perhaps to force him into silence, perhaps to force him to confess. That is crime number one. He turned to the study desk. But crime number two, Poirot continued, is that someone used that fear as camouflage. Eleanor's breath hitched. Poirot's eyes drifted to the candle in her hand. A whisper at midnight draws all attention to the clock, Poirot said. And while everyone watches the clock, something else can happen quietly. Lane swallowed. Like poison in a drink, Poirot nodded. Or a drug placed with just enough timing, Poirot added, that the heart appears to fail naturally under stress. Dr. Fenn's expression darkened. That is possible. Margaret's voice trembled. Who would do that? Poirot's gaze held hers. Someone who benefits from Reginald's death, Poirot said softly. Someone who fears what he knew. Someone who cannot allow his letter to be answered. He tapped the threatening note on the desk. This letter, Poirot said, was not simply a threat. It was a lever. Lane frowned. A lever. For what? Poirot's voice was calm. For inheritance. For blackmail. For confession. He turned to Eleanor. Madame Price, who inherits Blackthorne House? Eleanor stiffened. Miss Margaret, she is his closest kin. Margaret's lips parted slightly, then closed. Poirot nodded. And if Reginald had written a new will? Margaret snapped. He hadn't. Poirot smiled faintly. How sure you are? Dr. Fenn shifted. Reginald mentioned he was updating documents. He said it twice during my last visit. Margaret's composure cracked for a fraction of a second. Poirot saw it. That evening, Poirot requested one final thing before night fell. "The solicitor," he said. Lane blinked. "The solicitor?" Poirot nodded. "The family solicitor. The one who handles the will. The one Reginald trusted." Margaret's voice was sharp. "There's no need." Poirot's voice stayed gentle. "On the contrary, mademoiselle, there is every need." He looked toward the grandfather clock in the hall. "And tonight," Poirot added, "we will listen again." Lane's eyes widened. "It won't whisper now. Belle is gone." Poirot smiled. "Perhaps," he said, "but if someone else has been relying on that whisper to hide their work," he let the sentence hang, "then they may attempt it again." Eleanor's candle flame flickered. Margaret's hands clenched, and for the first time that day the clock in the hallway ticked just a little louder, as though time itself had heard Poirot's thought and approved. Tick, tick, tick. Blackthorn House held its breath once more, because Poirot had not come to arrest a thief. He had come to catch a murderer, the one who understood that the loudest distraction is the best cover for a quiet kill. Chapter 5. The Will That Arrived Before Dawn. The solicitor arrived as the light began to fail, not with the drama of a carriage or the urgency of a siren, but with the quiet inevitability of someone who knew his presence would change everything. Mr. Julian Harcourt was a thin man with careful manners, dressed in mourning black despite the fact that no funeral had yet been arranged. He carried a leather folio under his arm, and inside it, Poirot suspected, lay the true heart of the matter. Blackthorn House received him with restraint. Mrs. Eleanor Price took his coat. Constable Lane noted the time. Margaret Blackthorn watched him with an expression too carefully neutral to be natural. Only Hercule Poirot greeted him warmly. "Monsieur Harcourt," Poirot said, inclining his head, "time has brought you precisely when needed." Harcourt managed a thin smile. "It usually does, Monsieur Poirot, though rarely kindly." They gathered in the drawing room. Lamps were lit early, shadows pooling in corners like listeners who preferred not to be seen. Harcourt opened the folio. "I was instructed," he began, "to deliver the most recent testament of Reginald Blackthorn only after certain conditions were met." Margaret stiffened. "Conditions?" "Yes," Harcourt replied. "Specifically, his death." A silence settled. Poirot leaned back slightly, eyes half-lidded. "Please continue." Harcourt removed a sealed envelope. "This document was signed 3 weeks ago," he said. "In my office, Mr. Blackthorn was disturbed." Margaret's voice was sharp. "Disturbed? How?" Harcourt hesitated. "He believed someone close to him had stolen money in the past and concealed it. He also believed," Harcourt glanced briefly at Eleanor, then away, "that someone had been protecting that secret." Poirot's gaze sharpened. "He asked me," Harcourt continued, "to prepare a revised will, one that would not be read unless he died suddenly." Constable Lane shifted. "Why not immediately?" "Because," Harcourt said quietly, "he feared retaliation." Poirot nodded. "Fear has a way of managing schedules." Harcourt broke the seal. "The house," he read, "and its contents shall pass to my niece, Margaret Blackthorn, provided that no evidence emerges of coercion, concealment, or undue influence connected to my death." Margaret's breath escaped audibly. "If such evidence exists," Harcourt continued, "the property shall be placed in trust, overseen by the Crown until the matter is resolved." Poirot closed his eyes briefly. "A conditional inheritance," he murmured. "Most inconvenient." Margaret stood. "This is absurd. There is no such evidence." Poirot opened his eyes. "Is there not?" he asked gently. Harcourt continued reading. "In addition, any person found to have facilitated the concealment of financial wrongdoing shall forfeit claims, positions, and protections previously granted." Eleanor's candle hand trembled. Constable Lane looked up sharply. "Facilitated?" Harcourt nodded. "Those were Mr. Blackthorn's words." Poirot leaned forward. "And the letter found in the study?" Harcourt nodded again. "Dictated by Reginald himself. He intended to deliver it, but he delayed." Margaret's voice cracked. "Why?" Harcourt hesitated. "Because he was waiting for someone to confess." The room held its breath. Poirot rose. "Merci, Monsieur Harcourt," he said. "You have given us clarity." Harcourt closed the folio carefully. "Monsieur Poirot, may I ask—" Poirot raised a hand gently. "Not yet." He turned toward Margaret. Mademoiselle, Poirot said, when did you learn of this revised will? Margaret's composure slipped. I didn't. Poirot tilted his head. You did not suspect? No. Poirot's tone remained calm. And yet you were awake at midnight, expectant. Margaret's eyes flashed. Anyone would be. Poirot smiled faintly. Indeed, anyone with reason. Poirot turned next to Eleanor. Madame Price, he said gently, you have served this house faithfully. Eleanor nodded. All my life. And in that time, Poirot continued, you have protected its people. Yes. Even when protection meant silence? Eleanor's lips pressed together. Poirot nodded. That silence, madame. It has a cost. Lane stepped forward. Mrs. Price, did you know about the theft? Eleanor swallowed. I suspected, Poirot added softly. And when Reginald learned the truth, he intended to expose it. Eleanor closed her eyes. Yes, she whispered. The fire cracked softly. Poirot paced slowly, as though arranging time itself. Arthur Bell created the whisper, Poirot said. A brilliant, cruel distraction. He wanted fear to do his work. Margaret interjected. And it did? Poirot looked at her. Yes, but not in the way he intended. He turned to Eleanor. Madame, Poirot said, on the night of Reginald's death, who poured the brandy? Eleanor's breath caught. I did, she said quietly. Margaret turned sharply. Eleanor, Poirot raised a hand. And into that brandy, Poirot continued gently, you placed a tincture, something mild, something intended to calm, or perhaps to induce sleep. Eleanor nodded, tears forming. He was agitated. He wouldn't rest. I only wanted— Poirot's voice remained kind but firm. You wanted to protect him. Eleanor nodded. But, Poirot continued, you did not know that Arthur's whisper would strike at midnight, that Reginald would read his own threat at the same moment. Eleanor's shoulders shook. And that fear, Poirot finished softly, would meet the drug in his blood. Dr. Fenn spoke quietly. The combination could overwhelm the heart. Lane's face hardened. Mrs. Price, are you saying you poisoned him? Eleanor shook her head desperately. No, I never meant— Poirot interrupted gently. No one ever means the final thing. Margaret's voice cut through the room. Then she killed him. Poirot turned slowly. No, he said. She facilitated his death. Margaret stiffened. There's a difference. Poirot's gaze held hers. There is always a difference, Poirot said softly. And sometimes it matters. He turned to Harcourt. Monsieur, under the will, what happens if facilitation is proven? Harcourt cleared his throat. The inheritance is frozen. Poirot nodded. And if coercion is proven? Poirot asked. Harcourt hesitated. Then Miss Blackthorne forfeits immediate claim. Margaret's face drained of colour. Poirot watched her carefully. Now, Poirot said, we come to the quietest crime of all. He walked to the grandfather clock. Arthur Bell's whisper frightened Reginald. But someone else timed their act to that fear. He turned back to Margaret. You, Poirot said calmly, encouraged Eleanor to add something to the drink. Margaret shook her head violently. That's a lie. Poirot smiled faintly. You did not add it yourself. That would be crude. Margaret's voice trembled. You have no proof. Poirot nodded. Not yet. He looked to Harcourt. Did Reginald mention Margaret during your meeting? Harcourt hesitated, then nodded. He said she was anxious, pressing him, asking about the will. Margaret whispered, I was worried. Poirot's voice remained gentle. You were afraid of being disinherited. Margaret's mask cracked. I only wanted certainty, she said sharply, after years of living in his shadow. Poirot nodded. And certainty came at midnight. Poirot stepped back, hands clasped. Arthur Bell created fear, he said. Eleanor Price acted out of protection. But Margaret Blackthorne, you acted out of anticipation. Margaret laughed bitterly. You can't prove I told her anything. Poirot smiled. That is true, he said, which is why tonight we listen again. Lane's eyes widened. The clock won't whisper. Poirot turned the winding key gently. Oh, he said, it will. They gathered once more as night settled. The clock ticked. 11:59, Poirot looked at Eleanor. "Madame," he said softly, "the whisper you heard before was not complete." The clock chimed. 12. A faint sound emerged. Not words this time, a memory, a woman's voice, low, urgent. "Just a few drops. He won't know," Margaret screamed. Lane stepped forward. "Miss Blackthorne?" Poirot raised a hand. The whisper faded. Silence returned. Poirot turned to Margaret, sorrow in his eyes. "Time," he said gently, "has finished speaking." Chapter 6. The hour that passed. Judgment when the scream faded. Blackthorne House did not erupt into chaos. It stilled. The whisper had done its work. Not as spectacle, not as threat, but as confirmation, the final click of a lock that had been turning for years. The grandfather clock returned to its ordinary tick, indifferent now, as though time itself had concluded its testimony. Tick, tick, tick. Hercule Poirot remained motionless beside the clock, hands clasped, eyes lowered. He did not look at Margaret Blackthorne, who stood trembling near the fireplace, nor at Mrs. Eleanor Price, who had sunk into a chair as though her strength had been quietly removed. Poirot had learned when not to speak. Constable Everett Lane was the first to move. He stepped towards Margaret, his voice steady but changed. "Miss Blackthorne," he said, "I'm afraid I must ask you to come with me." Margaret laughed, a short, brittle sound that startled everyone. "You can't arrest me for a voice," she said, "for a trick hidden in a clock." Poirot lifted his head at last. "No," he said gently, "not for the voice." He turned toward her, his tone calm, precise, "for the timing." Margaret's composure shattered completely then. "You don't understand," she said sharply, her words tumbling over one another. "You think I planned this like some melodrama. I didn't. I lived in that house my entire life, waiting for permission to exist." Poirot listened. "He controlled everything," she continued. "Money, reputation, futures. He let Arthur take the blame because Arthur deserved to be afraid. He let Eleanor clean up after everyone because she always would." Eleanor sobbed quietly. "And me?" Margaret's voice rose. "He dangled inheritance like mercy. I asked questions. I wanted to know where I stood." Poirot nodded. "And when you learned you might stand nowhere?" Margaret's lips trembled. "I panicked," she whispered. "I didn't know Arthur would do that. I didn't know Eleanor would add the tincture." Poirot's voice was firm but kind. "But you encouraged it." Margaret closed her eyes. "I said he needed rest," she whispered, "that his nerves were fragile, that a few drops would help." Dr. Holden Fenn spoke quietly from the doorway. "Combined with shock, it could be lethal." Margaret nodded, tears spilling freely now. "I never touched the glass. I never stood over him." Poirot inclined his head. "No, you stood over the moment." Constable Lane cleared his throat. "Miss Blackthorne," he said, "under the law, encouragement that leads to death." Margaret's laugh turned hollow. "I know what it means." She straightened, shoulders squared with a defiance that felt like habit rather than courage. "Take me," she said. Lane did. As Margaret was led from the room, Blackthorne House exhaled for the second time in 2 days, but this breath was colder, more final. The solicitor, Julian Harcourt, closed his folio with a soft snap. "I will notify the Crown," he said. "The estate will be placed in trust immediately?" Poirot nodded. "That is just." Harcourt hesitated. "And Mrs. Price?" All eyes turned to Eleanor. She looked impossibly small now, candle extinguished, hands folded in her lap. Poirot answered gently, "Mrs. Price will answer for her actions, but the law understands degrees." Lane nodded slowly. "Facilitation, not intent." Eleanor looked up at Poirot, eyes shining with regret. "I thought I was protecting him," she whispered. Poirot met her gaze. "You were protecting the past." She nodded, as if that explained everything. By morning, Blackthorne House was quieter than it had ever been. The constable's car departed with Margaret inside. The solicitor left with documents and instructions. Dr. Fenn returned to his practice, burdened now with the knowledge of how close medicine sometimes walks beside crime. Only Poirot remained. He stood alone in the east hallway, watching the grandfather clock. Tick, tick, tick. "Tell me," he murmured softly, "what you kept." The clock did not answer, and Poirot did not expect it to. Mrs. Eleanor Price approached him hesitantly. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, "will the house be sold?" Poirot considered this. "Perhaps," he said. "Or perhaps it will be allowed to become something else." Eleanor nodded. "It deserves that." Poirot turned toward her. "And you, madame?" She straightened. "I will accept whatever is decided." Poirot studied her kindly. "Guilt that is accepted often becomes lighter." She managed a faint smile. Later that afternoon, Poirot requested to see the study once more. He sat at Reginald Blackthorne's desk, where the man had breathed his last. The chair creaked softly beneath Poirot's weight, a sound that had once meant authority and now meant nothing at all. Poirot removed his gloves and placed them carefully on the desk. "Reginald Blackthorne," he said quietly, "you believed control was safety." He looked around the room. "And in teaching others to fear time, you forgot that it teaches patience as well?" Poirot rose and closed the study door behind him. At dusk, Poirot packed his suitcase. The housekeeper's room was lit softly, Eleanor's belongings already half-organized for a future not yet defined. Somewhere down the hall, the clock chimed 6, a mundane sound again. Poirot paused at the doorway. "Madam," he said gently, "one day people will say the clock was cursed." Eleanor shook her head. "It wasn't." Poirot smiled. "No, it was honest." The train departed that evening. Poirot took a window seat, watching Blackthorne House recede into the landscape, its tall windows dark, its silhouette softened by distance. He reflected, as he always did, not on the crime itself, but on what had enabled it. Arthur Bell had feared exposure. Eleanor Price had feared disruption. Margaret Blackthorne had feared uncertainty. And Reginald Blackthorne had feared losing control. Fear, Poirot knew, was the most efficient accomplice. As the train gathered speed, Poirot removed a small notebook and wrote a single line. "When time whispers, it is never lying, it is only waiting." He closed the notebook, adjusted his moustache, and allowed the rhythm of the rails to settle his thoughts. Tick, tick, tick. The sound followed him, not as a whisper, but as a reminder. Chapter 7. The Broadcast After Midnight. The next morning, the village spoke softly. Blackthorne House had always been a landmark, a place people pointed to. When giving directions, a silhouette that made the countryside feel older than it was, but after Reginald Blackthorne died at midnight and a clock whispered words that should not exist, the house stopped being merely a building. It became a story, and stories, Poirot knew, never remained contained within their walls. By 10 o'clock, the grocer's wife had retold the tale twice. By noon, the vicar had been asked whether the clock was possessed. And by evening the innkeeper had decided he would never again serve a drink at 11:59. The village needed an explanation that felt safe. It would not get one, not the kind it wanted. Hercule Poirot returned to Blackthorne House only briefly that day, not to investigate but to observe what remained after the truth had been spoken. He arrived by foot, walking the long lane from the station with his suitcase in hand. The air smelled of damp leaves and distant smoke. The season had shifted, subtly but decisively, and the countryside seemed to agree that some chapters should close before winter arrived. The house greeted him with quiet. Mrs. Eleanor Price opened the door herself, her expression worn and gentler than before. The rigidity that had defined her seemed softened now by exhaustion and acceptance. "Monsieur Poirot," she said quietly, "you've come back." Poirot inclined his head. "Only for a moment, madame." Eleanor stepped aside. "The constable said the Crown will send someone within the week." Poirot nodded. "Yes, that is how it will be." Eleanor hesitated. "I do not know where I will go." Poirot looked at her kindly. "Somewhere that is not built on silence." Her eyes shimmered. "I thought silence was loyalty." Poirot's voice was gentle. "Loyalty can become a cage, madame. One does not notice until the door is locked." Poirot walked the east hall past the grandfather clock. It's ticked normally now. Tick, tick, tick. In daylight, it looked harmless. Polished wood, brass pendulum, glass face, a proud relic. And yet Poirot felt the faintest lingering unease, the way one might feel after waking from a dream that was almost but not quite forgotten. Eleanor watched him. "Do you hate it?" she asked softly. Poirot paused. "Hate the clock?" "Yes. After what it—" Poirot shook his head. "No, I do not hate objects, madame. I hate what people ask them to carry." Eleanor nodded as though that made sense in a way her heart understood, even if her mind resisted. Poirot leaned slightly closer to the clock's face. "The clock did not whisper because it was wicked," he murmured. "It whispered because it was used," he straightened, "and because time has a curious way of returning what is hidden." They moved to the drawing room. The room felt emptier without Margaret's sharp presence, without Arthur's nervous energy. Even Reginald's authority seemed to have evaporated, leaving only furniture and air. Poirot sat, folding his gloves neatly on his knee. Eleanor remained standing. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, "the village will never believe it wasn't supernatural." Poirot smiled faintly. "They prefer superstition because it asks less of them." Eleanor frowned. "Less?" Poirot nodded. "If a clock is cursed, then no one is responsible. But if a clock is used, then someone chose." Eleanor's eyes lowered. "Yes." Poirot's gaze softened. "And they will not like that. Responsibility is heavier than ghosts." That afternoon, Constable Lane visited with paperwork. He looked tired, as though sleep had refused him since the whisper. "Monsieur Poirot," he said, "the magistrate will want a statement. About the mechanism, about the so-called recording." Poirot nodded. "I will write what is true, but I cannot write what will satisfy the village." Lane exhaled. "They're already calling it the Whispering Curse." Poirot gave a small, humorless smile. "Of course they are." Lane hesitated. "Is it wrong to let them believe it, if it keeps them calm?" Poirot looked at him sharply. "Calm built on lies is fragile," Poirot said quietly. "It breaks when needed most." Lane nodded slowly. He glanced down the corridor toward the clock. "I keep thinking about the voice we heard." Poirot's eyes narrowed. "Which voice, Constable?" Lane blinked. "The woman. Just a few drops." Poirot nodded. "That voice," Poirot said softly, "was the most important broadcast Blackthorn House ever made." Lane frowned. "Broadcast?" Poirot smiled faintly. "Yes, it was a transmission, an announcement, a confession released into air." Lane swallowed. "I'll never forget it." Poirot's tone softened. "Nor should you." When Lane left, Poirot walked to the study once more. The room was still. Dust motes drifted lazily in the light. The desk had been cleared, the threatening letter removed into evidence. Only the shape of Reginald's life remained. Books, ledger marks, the faint scent of old ink. Poirot stood where Reginald had sat. He imagined the man as he had been, controlling, proud, a master of leverage. Reginald had believed he owned the house. But houses, Poirot knew, owned their occupants more often than the reverse. He looked at the spot where the brandy glass had once stood. "A few drops," Poirot murmured. "Not enough to kill unless the hour is correct. Time again. Always time." As evening arrived, the village radio station, a modest operation 2 miles away, aired a short announcement about Reginald Blackthorn's death. They did not mention whispers. They did not mention the clock. They called it a tragic passing. But in the village, truth traveled through quieter channels. It moved from lips to ears in kitchens and barns, from a glance to a nod at market stalls. It moved the way older news always moved, slowly but thoroughly. And what reached people was not that Margaret Blackthorn had been arrested, nor that Arthur Bell was a thief. What reached them was this: the house had been full of ordinary people, and ordinary people had done extraordinary harm, not out of madness, but out of fear and hope and the desire to control what could not be controlled. That frightened them more than any ghost. That night, Poirot stayed at the inn rather than the house. He preferred distance. The inn's common room was quiet, but not silent. A few travelers spoke softly. A fire crackled. The world felt alive again. Poirot sat with his tea, watching the clock on the mantel, a small, cheap thing that kept time without drama. A man at the bar leaned toward another and whispered, "They say that clock still talks at midnight." Poirot did not turn. The other man replied, "Nonsense, clocks don't talk." The first man shrugged. "This one did." Poirot took a sip of tea and thought, yes, it did, because someone needed it to. Before retiring, Poirot wrote his statement for the magistrate. He chose his words carefully. He explained the structure of grandfather clocks, how they could amplify sound, how hidden chambers could carry vibrations longer than expected, how a fragment of recorded speech, stored and released by mechanical timing, could seem uncanny to those who did not understand mechanics. But he also wrote something else, something the magistrate would likely ignore. He wrote, "The true mechanism was not inside the clock. It was inside the people." Poirot set down his pen. He knew the official report would focus on devices and timing and culpability. It would treat the case as a matter of law, but Poirot's mind treated it as something older, a matter of conscience. At 11:58, Poirot sat up in bed. He had not intended to stay awake, but habit, like the clock, had its own pull. He listened, not for a whisper, for the absence of one. 11:59. The inn's mantel clock ticked. 12. It chimed softly, a small sound, almost shy. No whisper followed. Poirot closed his eyes. "That," he murmured, "is how it should be." In Blackthorn House, the grandfather clock chimed midnight too. No one stood in the hall, no one waited with candles, no one held their breath. The clock's chime traveled down empty corridors and faded into ordinary silence. For the first time in many nights, midnight passed without a message. And that, Poirot believed, was the closest thing to mercy Blackthorn House would ever know. Chapter 8. The Confession That Took Its Time. The confession did not arrive with drama. It arrived with paperwork. At precisely 9:30 the following morning, a sealed envelope was delivered to Constable Everett Lane's desk. It bore Arthur Bell's handwriting, neat, measured, unmistakably his, and inside it lay the one thing Poirot had been waiting for, a confession that did not defend itself. Hercule Poirot read the document later that afternoon, seated by the inn's window with a cup of tea growing cold beside him. He read it once, then again, and when he finished, he nodded, not in triumph, but in confirmation. Arthur Bell wrote plainly. He admitted to the theft years earlier, small sums at first, then larger ones, always justified as temporary, always returned eventually, always hidden by clever bookkeeping and the assumption that no one would ever look closely enough. He admitted to the whispering clock, the careful study of its interior, the discovery of a resonance chamber, the patient testing late at night when the house slept. He described how recorded fragments of Reginald Blackthorn's own voice had been captured during heated arguments and embedded within the clock's mechanism, released by vibration at midnight. But the most important line came near the end. "I did not intend to kill Reginald Blackthorn. I intended to frighten him into silence. I believed fear would control him, as he had controlled all of us." Poirot set the paper down. "Yes," he murmured, "that is exactly the mistake." The mistake was not fear, it was timing. Arthur Bell had believed fear could be calibrated, that it could be applied like pressure to a valve, tightened and loosened without consequence. He had forgotten that fear, once introduced, did not remain obedient. Fear spread, it sought allies, and in Blackthorn House it found them. The Constable Lane arrived at the inn shortly after noon, hat under his arm, expression grave. "Bell has signed it all," he said. "He's given details only someone involved could know." Poirot nodded. "Good." Lane hesitated. "He also named names." Poirot looked up. "Not accusations," Lane clarified. "Context, pressure, conversations." Poirot folded his hands. "Yes, confessions that explain are the most dangerous kind," Lane swallowed. He wrote that Margaret Blackthorn encouraged the idea of timing, not the whisper but the moment, that she spoke often of midnight, of decisions being made then. Poirot nodded slowly. "Margaret believed midnight was a deadline." Lane sighed. And Eleanor? Poirot's gaze softened. Eleanor believed midnight was protection. Lane looked troubled. So who killed Reginald Blackthorne? Poirot considered this carefully. Reginald Blackthorne, he said at last, was killed by convergence. Lane frowned. That won't satisfy a court, Poirot smiled faintly. It rarely does. Later that day, Poirot visited Arthur Bell in custody. Arthur looked smaller now, stripped of routine and justification. His hands trembled slightly as he folded them on the table. I didn't think it would go so far, Arthur said quickly. I swear it, Poirot nodded. That is why you are here, Monsieur Bell, because you swear. Arthur's eyes filled. He terrified us. All of us. Poirot's voice was gentle. Fear explains many things. It excuses none. Arthur looked down. Do you think I'm a murderer? Poirot paused. I think, he said carefully, that you created a storm and then stepped aside, believing yourself dry. Arthur flinched. You knew he was vulnerable, Poirot continued. You knew Eleanor would intervene. You knew Margaret watched the clock as if it owed her something, Arthur whispered. I never touched the glass. Poirot nodded. No, but you rang the bell. Arthur's voice broke. Will the clock be destroyed? Poirot tilted his head. Why do you ask? Arthur swallowed. Because it was clever. Poirot's eyes hardened slightly. Cleverness, he said softly, is not a defense. It is a warning sign. Arthur nodded, ashamed. Poirot rose. Time will speak for you now, he said, and it will not whisper. That evening, Poirot walked once more through Blackthorne House, this time with permission. The Crown's representative had not yet arrived, and the house stood in a strange interim state, no longer private, not yet public, a place between ownerships. Poirot paused at the study doorway. The desk had been cleared entirely. No papers, no lamp, no glass. Only the faint indentation where years of elbows had pressed. Authority into wood. Poirot stood there quietly. Reginald Blackthorne, he said aloud. You believed leverage was legacy. He looked around the empty room. But legacy, he murmured, is what remains when leverage fails. In the hallway, the grandfather clock ticked. Tick, tick, tick. Poirot listened. There was no echo, no vibration, no whisper waiting to be released. The mechanism had been dismantled earlier that day under Lane's supervision. No mystery remained, only brass and wood and the residue of intention. Eleanor Price stood nearby, watching Poirot. They're taking it apart, she said softly. The clock. Poirot nodded. Yes? Eleanor hesitated. Is that right? Poirot considered. It is necessary, he said, but not complete. Eleanor frowned. What do you mean? Poirot met her gaze. People will still say it whispered, he said. They will still say midnight was cursed, Eleanor sighed. They already are. Poirot smiled faintly. Then the clock will continue to do its work, without a mechanism. Eleanor's eyes widened slightly. You mean memory? Poirot nodded. Exactly. That night, Margaret Blackthorne was transferred to county custody. Poirot did not see her again, but he received a letter 2 days later, written in a precise, angry hand that wavered only once. Monsieur Poirot, you were right about one thing. Midnight was my deadline. I spent my life waiting for permission. I thought time owed me clarity. It doesn't. Poirot folded the letter and placed it with the others. Time owes nothing, he murmured. It collects. By the end of the week, the magistrate's preliminary findings were clear. Arthur Bell would stand trial for theft, intimidation, and mechanical deception, contributing to death. Eleanor Price would face a reduced charge for facilitation without intent. Margaret Blackthorne would be charged for coercion and inducement, resulting in fatal outcome. The estate would remain in trust pending final judgment. The village reacted as villages always do, with opinion disguised as certainty. Some blamed Arthur alone, some blamed Margaret, some blamed Reginald, some blamed the clock. Poirot blamed none of them exclusively. On his final evening in the area, Poirot returned to the inn and sat near the fireplace. The radio murmured softly, a news bulletin, then music. A man at the next table said, "They say the clock made them confess." Poirot did not turn. Another replied, "Nonsense, people confess when they're ready." Poirot smiled into his tea. "Exactly," he murmured. At 11:58, Poirot glanced at the inn's mantel clock. It was small, unimpressive, stubbornly ordinary. 11:59, 12. It chimed once. Nothing followed. Poirot closed his eyes briefly. The truth, he reflected, does not need repetition. As he prepared to leave the next morning, Constable Lane met him at the door. "Monsieur Poirot," Lane said, "the village asked if you'd like the clock preserved, as a curiosity." Poirot shook his head gently. "No," he said. "Preserve the lesson, not the object." Lane nodded. Poirot picked up his suitcase. "Tell them," Poirot added. That time did not whisper because it was angry. Lane frowned. "Why did it whisper then?" Poirot smiled faintly. "Because someone asked it to." The train pulled away. Blackthorn House receded into distance, its silhouette soft against the morning sky. Somewhere inside, the space where the grandfather clock had stood was now empty, a tall, quiet absence. And that absence, Poirot believed, would speak more clearly than any whisper ever could. Chapter 9. When the clock was gone, the space where the clock had stood felt taller than the ceiling. That was the first thing Hercule Poirot noticed when he returned to Blackthorn House for the final time. Without the grandfather clock anchoring the east hallway, the corridor seemed to stretch upward, as though relieved of a long-held burden. No tick, no chime, no whisper, just air, honest, unoccupied air. Poirot paused there longer than necessary, suitcase resting by his side. He had learned that absence often spoke more clearly than presence, and this house was now speaking plainly. Mrs. Eleanor Price stood near the doorway to the drawing-room, hands folded, posture uncertain. Without the rhythm of service, without Reginald Blackthorn's demands, without the nightly ritual of listening for something to go wrong, she seemed unsure where to place herself. "They took it. This morning," she said softly. "The clock." Poirot nodded. "Yes. They said it would be catalogued, studied, explained." Poirot smiled faintly. "Everything wishes to be explained once it is finished." Eleanor looked at the empty space again. "I never realized how much of my life was set by that sound." Poirot turned to her. "Time is like that, madame. It does not command us loudly. It persuades." The house was nearly empty now. Furniture had been covered, drawers sealed, documents removed by the Crown's representatives. Blackthorn House no longer belonged to a family. It belonged to process. And process, Poirot knew, was colder than grief. He walked through the rooms one by one, not to search but to acknowledge. The drawing-room where Margaret once stood rigid with calculation. The study where Reginald Blackthorn mistook control for permanence. The guest wing where Arthur Bell rehearsed fear until fear became rehearsal. Each room held echoes, not supernatural ones but psychological, the kind that lingered until named. Poirot returned to the study last. The desk was gone, not moved, removed. In its place remained a faint rectangle of lighter wood, unmarked by years of pressure. Poirot stood over it, imagining Reginald Blackthorn there, alive, commanding, certain that he understood the machinery of people. "You believed time could be managed," Poirot said softly to the empty room. He shook his head gently. "Time manages us." Outside, the village continued. That was perhaps the strangest part. Carts still passed, chickens still wandered. The vicar still rang the church bell on schedule. Blackthorn House had lost its centre, but the world had not paused to mourn it. Poirot found that reassuring. At the edge of the lane, Constable Lane waited, hat in hand. "Monsieur Poirot," he said, "I wanted to tell you the magistrate read your statement carefully." Poirot raised an eyebrow. "All of it?" Lane smiled thinly. "Not all." Poirot nodded. "As expected." Lane hesitated. "But he did underline one sentence." Poirot waited. Lane cleared his throat. "The clock was not the cause. It was the permission." Poirot smiled faintly. Ah, Lane shook his head slowly. I don't think I'll ever hear midnight the same way again. Poirot met his gaze. That is the correct outcome. That afternoon, Poirot received one final letter. It was from Eleanor Price. She had written it after speaking with the magistrate, after accepting the terms of her charge, after understanding that loyalty did not excuse consequence. Monsieur Poirot, I believed my duty was to keep the house intact. I now see that I kept it dangerous. Wherever I go next, there will be no clocks louder than my conscience. Poirot folded the letter carefully. Yes, he murmured. That is how time teaches. Margaret Blackthorne's name began to fade from conversation. At first it had been spoken sharply, with outrage, fascination, even a hint of admiration from those who mistook ambition for strength. But as weeks passed, her name lost its heat. She became a caution. Arthur Bell's confession, too, became quieter with repetition. Once stripped of cleverness, it was merely sad. A man who believed intelligence could replace integrity. Reginald Blackthorne, ironically, became the loudest absence of all. People remembered his authority, his wealth, his control, and then, slowly, they remembered how afraid he had been of losing it. On Poirot's final evening in the village, he sat alone at the inn. The radio played softly, music this time, not news. A small clock hung above the bar, cheap and efficient, ticking with no ambition beyond accuracy. A young man nearby said, "They say the house will be sold." Another replied, "Good, it needs new voices." Poirot smiled into his tea. Yes, he thought, and quieter ones. At 11:59, Poirot glanced at the bar clock. 11:59:12. It chimed once. No whisper followed. Poirot felt a subtle satisfaction, not relief, but confirmation. When truth had been spoken fully, it did not repeat itself. The next morning, Poirot departed before sunrise. The village slept. Blackthorne House stood in silhouette against the pale sky, empty but upright, no longer watchful, no longer whispering. As the train moved away, Poirot allowed himself one final reflection. The clock had not been a monster, nor had it been a miracle. It had been a mirror, reflecting fear back at those who fed it, and when the mirror was removed, the fear had nowhere left to hide. Poirot adjusted his moustache, closed his eyes, and listened not for time, but for stillness. Chapter 10. The Last Chime of Blackthorne House. Some endings arrive loudly, with slammed doors and raised voices and footsteps marching away. This one arrived with the sound of a train. It carried Hercule Poirot toward London, while Blackthorne House remained behind, empty and upright, a silhouette that had finally stopped demanding attention. Poirot sat by the window, gloved hands folded, watching the countryside blur into soft greens and greys. The rhythm of the rails was steady, honest. It reminded him of a clock that did its job without theatrics. Tick, 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 no whisper. And that, he thought, was the truest sign that the case had ended. At the next stop, Poirot stepped down briefly to stretch his legs. The station was small and quiet. A porter nodded politely. Somewhere nearby, a child laughed, and the carefree sound of a world that did not know what Blackthorne House had learned. Poirot returned to his compartment and opened his notebook. He did not write about Arthur Bell's cleverness. He did not write about Margaret's ambition. He did not even write about Reginald Blackthorne's death. Instead, he wrote a single question. What does a house become when its secrets are removed? Poirot looked out again and considered. A house could become free, or it could become haunted by what it had once been. Freedom, he knew, required something difficult. It required new habits. Back in the village, Blackthorne House waited, not like a predator now, not like a witness, like a room after a confession, quiet, clean, and slightly ashamed. The Crown's representative arrived with 2 clocks and an inventory list long enough to feel like scripture. They moved through the rooms with paper and pens, recording chairs and paintings and silverware, treating objects as though they were the only truth that mattered. They measured curtains, they counted plates, they catalogued books. Yet none of them wrote down the one thing Poirot would have recorded immediately, the feeling, because feelings did not fit neatly into ledgers. And ledgers were the language of authority, Reginald Blackthorne's language. As the clerks worked, Mrs. Eleanor Price stood quietly by the doorway, watching. Her life had been built on service and silence, and now the house was being stripped of both. A clerk glanced at her. "Are you remaining in the district, Mrs. Price?" Eleanor hesitated. "I have not decided." The clerk nodded as if that was acceptable and continued writing. Eleanor looked down the corridor where the grandfather clock had once stood. The space was still empty, but she could almost hear the tick in her bones. The trial dates were set quickly. Arthur Bell's case was clear: theft, mechanical deception, intimidation, and negligence contributing to death. He was guilty, undeniably, even if his hands had never poured the drug. Margaret Blackthorne's case was colder, more complicated. A court struggled with words like inducement and coercion, with the ethics of a suggestion that became fatal. Eleanor Price's case was perhaps the hardest for the public to swallow. People liked villains. They liked monsters. They did not like an elderly housekeeper who had believed she was helping. Yet Poirot, sitting miles away with his tea and his quiet conscience, understood this too well. The most dangerous people were rarely theatrical. They were practical. Days later, Poirot received one final update from Constable Lane. The letter was brief and respectful. "Monsieur Poirot, the house will be sold at auction once the trust allows. They say buyers are already interested, not in its history, but in its land. The village is calmer, still uneasy at midnight, but calmer. As for the clock, it has been placed in storage. They asked if it should be displayed. I said no." Poirot folded the letter carefully. "Good," he murmured. To display the clock would be to turn tragedy into entertainment, and Poirot did not approve of such things. That evening, Poirot attended a small dinner in London with acquaintances who admired him for the wrong reasons. They spoke of crime with a fascination that bordered on hunger. They asked questions as though the pain of others was a puzzle designed for their amusement. "Tell us," a gentleman said with a grin, "did the clock truly whisper?" Poirot smiled politely. "The clock," Poirot said, "did what it was made to do." The gentleman laughed. "Keep time?" Poirot's eyes remained calm. "Keep consequences." The table quieted. They did not know how to respond to a remark that sounded like philosophy rather than spectacle. Poirot excused himself early. Later, alone in his apartment, Poirot stood by his mantel clock. It was small, elegant, and utterly ordinary. It ticked with steady humility. Tick, tick, tick. Poirot adjusted it slightly, ensuring it was perfectly aligned with the shelf's edge. Perfection comforted him. Disorder belonged to criminals. He sat, and for a moment the case returned to him, not as a story but as a sensation. A house holding its breath, a hallway lit by candles, a whisper emerging from wood and brass, and the scream that followed. Poirot closed his eyes. He did not see Margaret's face, nor Arthur's panic, nor Reginald's rigid authority. He saw only the one thing that connected them all: a need to control the outcome. Poirot opened his eyes and spoke softly, as though addressing the unseen listeners of a late-night broadcast. "People think time is the enemy," he murmured. "They fear it because it changes things." He paused. "But time does not destroy truth. It merely waits until we are tired enough to stop holding it back." He reached for his notebook and wrote again, this time not a question but a line he wished someone in Blackthorne House had understood years earlier. "You cannot outrun time. You can only choose what it catches you carrying." He set the notebook down. Outside, London moved. Carriages, voices, distant footsteps, life continuing in its brilliant indifference. Poirot listened, and for once, he did not feel burdened. He felt certain. The case was sealed. Classic Radio Outro, listener facing farewell. And so, dear listeners, the mystery of the whispering clock at midnight comes to its end. Not with a ghost, not with a curse, but with something far more human. A whisper is not always supernatural. Sometimes it is simply the past refusing to stay silent. In Blackthorne House, fear spoke first, but time spoke last. If you found yourself listening a little closer tonight, to the tick of a clock, to the hush of a hallway, to the silence after an argument, then perhaps you have already learned what Poirot knew from the beginning. Midnight does not create monsters, it only reveals them. Good night and pleasant dreams. And should you hear a whisper when the hour grows late, ask yourself, is it the clock or is it the truth?